A war doesn't stay on the battlefield anymore. It shows up in fertilizer prices, gas pumps, shipping lanes, and the shape of the map itself. And when the headlines call that stability, the people living under it are already paying for the lie. Today's stories look unrelated if you only skim them. Nebraska workers are getting crushed by the cost of the Iran war. US and Iranian negotiators are still trading terms while missiles and drones keep flying. Israel is fortifying Gaza instead of leaving it. And in Lebanon, medics are being killed in attacks that are still being described as somehow normal. We're going to line up the reports, compare the language, and ask the questions most coverage avoids. Who benefits from this version of events? What is being hidden by the word ceasefire? And why does every supposedly temporary measure keep becoming permanent? The first article sounds like a local politics story, but it's really a war story in disguise. In Nebraska, the war with Iran is driving up fertilizer, energy, and shipping costs, and that means farmers are getting squeezed from every direction. The report focuses on Dan Osborn, an independent Senate candidate and former union mechanic, because his campaign is exposing something a lot of politicians would rather keep abstract. When a war raises input costs, the damage doesn't stay overseas. Osborn's personal story makes the point almost too clearly. He's not some polished insider talking about macroeconomic trends from a studio chair. He's the kind of guy who had to stop pumping gas because the bill was running past what he could cover that week. That detail matters because it turns an argument about geopolitics into something ordinary people recognize immediately. Inflation is no longer just a headline number. It's a mortgage payment. It's a fuel tank. It's whether you can keep the lights on while the people in charge talk about short-term pain. And Nebraska is a good place to see the broader fallout. The state depends heavily on agriculture and food-related industries, which means the price of urea fertilizer isn't some technical footnote. When that cost jumps by more than half in a short period, farmers don't just grumble. They cut back on fertilizer, lower yields, and start planning for years ahead with less confidence. That's the part mainstream coverage often misses. War isn't only destructive in the moment, it warps future decision-making. It pushes everyone downstream into caution, debt, and shrinkage. What's striking is how the article pairs this with Pete Ricketts, a billionaire-backed Republican whose family money and political insulation make him almost the perfect foil. Ricketts votes against war powers resolutions, shrugs off the public cost, and keeps repeating the same familiar logic. We're defending national interests. But whose interests exactly? Because when a war raises costs for farmers, workers, and consumers while benefiting defense contractors, oil traders, and political donors, the national part starts to look selective. And that's the tension the article doesn't say outright but makes impossible to ignore. Osborn's appeal isn't just that he's an outsider, it's that he treats war as a cost center instead of a moral abstraction. That should be a baseline expectation in a democracy, not a radical position. If you're getting value from this kind of breakdown, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. That contrast also reveals something bigger about the political class. They love to talk about freedom, markets, and strength, but the minute those slogans run into real bills, real shortages, and real trade-offs, the people selling the story disappear behind patriotic language. In practice, the burden gets pushed onto workers first, and everyone else is told to be patient. That's not free markets. That's public sacrifice with private insulation. Now zoom out to the war itself. Multiple reports say Iran has put forward a framework for ending the conflict, but the details matter more than the optimism around them. On the surface, officials keep saying the talks are progressing or that a deal could come together in days. Yet the moment you read past the headline, you find conditions that look less like compromise and more like a negotiation over who gets to call the end of a war without actually ending the coercion. Iran's reported proposal includes reopening the Strait of Hormuz, but only if the U.S. ends its blockade of Iranian ports, releases frozen assets, and agrees to a real end to the fighting before moving on to the nuclear issue. That sequencing is important. Iran is basically saying, stop the war first, then talk about the rest. Washington, meanwhile, keeps trying to bundle everything together, which sounds neat on paper and usually benefits the side already holding the biggest military lever. That's where the language starts to get slippery. The U.S. calls its strikes self-defense, even when they hit vessels near Bandar Abbas or targets around the strait. Iran calls those attacks violations of a ceasefire and signs of bad faith. Both sides claim they want de-escalation, but each round of diplomacy seems to come with a fresh military message attached. It's hard to trust any process where talks are happening in one room and warnings are landing in another. A lot of mainstream reporting treats this as a chess match between equals. That framing hides the asymmetry. The U.S. and its allies can impose blockades, sanctions, and airstrikes, then describe the result as pressure for peace. Iran responds by trying to preserve leverage through shipping routes, asset demands, and military deterrence. You don't have to romanticize Tehran to notice the imbalance. One side is enforcing global choke points, the other is trying to keep from being strangled by them. There's also a deeper contradiction in the U.S. position. American officials insist Iran can't keep enriched uranium, can't threaten shipping lanes, can't control the strait, and can't expect sanctions relief unless it accepts Washington's terms. But then those same officials talk as if a deal is just around the corner. Those two ideas don't really fit together. Either the terms are close enough for a settlement, or the demands are still so maximal that progress is mostly public relations. And the military backdrop keeps undermining the diplomacy narrative. Reports of drone shootdowns, retaliatory strikes, and warnings from the IRGC show that both sides are still operating under the assumption that peace might fail at any moment. That doesn't look like confidence. It looks like armed bargaining. The problem is that ordinary people are the ones forced to live with the uncertainty while officials argue over wording. There's another piece mainstream coverage barely touches. The economic warfare is the point, not just a side effect. When shipping gets disrupted, energy prices jump, farm inputs spike, and the shock spreads well beyond the region. That's why Nebraska farmers, Gulf shippers, European refiners, and Asian importers all end up trapped in the same policy machine. It's not just about punishing Iran, it's about proving the U.S. can still command the flow of trade even if the cost is felt far away from Washington. If the Iran story is about coercion dressed as diplomacy, Gaza is where the disguise has almost fallen apart completely. Forensic Architecture's latest findings show Israel has built more than 25 kilometers of earthen barriers inside Gaza since the ceasefire, physically dividing the strip and turning the so-called temporary line into an expanding wall. That should matter to anyone who still thinks ceasefires automatically lead to withdrawal. They don't, not if the side with the army decides that pause actually means rearranging the territory while the world looks elsewhere. The article makes a blunt point through satellite evidence. Instead of retreating, Israel has fortified bases, cleared rubble, paved roads, and pushed deeper into Palestinian land. Control has gone from roughly half the strip to more than 60%. Mainstream coverage often stops at the announcement stage. Ceasefire signed, hostages exchanged, fighting reduced. That's the feel-good version. What gets skipped is the slow engineering of permanence. Once a wall goes up, once buffer zones are carved out, once schools and neighborhoods are flattened into no man's land, the political map changes even if the headline doesn't. This is where the article's analysis cuts through the official language. A ceasefire is being treated less like a cessation of violence and more like a phase in a larger project. And when resistance leaders say the US and Israel are trying to impose new terms that Hamas never agreed to, especially disarmament first and reconstruction later, they're describing a pattern that's bigger than Gaza. It's the old formula. Surrender your leverage, then maybe we'll consider your survival. That's why the Board of Peace framing is so revealing. The name sounds administrative, even benevolent, but the actual demand is domination. Palestinians are supposed to accept Israeli control, give up their weapons, and trust that reconstruction will follow. History suggests that sequence usually runs the other way only if the occupied side has real leverage. Without it, the promise of rebuilding becomes a bargaining chip. And there's something else the coverage consistently softens. The article about Gaza isn't just about military hardware or land use. It's about the conversion of a political question into a spatial one. If you can't erase a people, you try to manage them with roads, lines, barriers, and zones. That's not peace. That's containment with branding. The human cost is still ongoing. More than 900 Palestinians have reportedly been killed since the ceasefire began, and aid flows remain far below what was promised. So when officials say the arrangement is working for who? Not for the families counting deaths, not for the people living in the compressed half of Gaza that keeps getting smaller, and not for anyone pretending that a fortified occupation is the same thing as a political solution. Lebanon may be the most underexamined part of this whole picture because the violence there is now easy for the public to file under ongoing conflict. That word is doing a lot of work. Israeli strikes have killed dozens in recent waves, including children, one soldier, and repeated numbers of paramedics and rescue workers. A lot of the reporting from the ground is not about combatants at all. It's about medics, ambulances, hospitals, and entire neighborhoods being hit while people flee. That should set off alarms, but instead, it often gets framed as a tragic byproduct of military necessity. The people on the ground tell a different story. They describe double-tap strikes, destroy health centers, and rescue crews being hit as they arrive. That is not a side note. It is a pattern. And once again, the official Israeli line is that Hezbollah infrastructure is the target. But when the majority of the dead are civilians, and when hospitals and ambulance stations keep getting damaged, the word targeted starts sounding less descriptive and more evasive. The article about Lebanon makes clear that the war has not paused just because a ceasefire exists on paper. It has become a managed exception, where the violence continues until the public gets tired of noticing. That's the part mainstream coverage most often fails to say plainly enough. Repeated violations don't mean the ceasefire is imperfect. They may mean the ceasefire is functioning exactly as intended by the side with a superior force. Keep the language of peace, keep the pressure on, keep the territory under control, and make everyone else adapt to the new normal. The big pattern today is simple, even if the headlines aren't. War is no longer separate from the economy. It's hitting farmers, workers, and consumers far from the battlefield. Diplomacy around Iran is being shaped by coercion, not trust, and the public language of progress keeps clashing with the actual terms on the table. In Gaza, ceasefire has become a cover for fortification, territorial consolidation, and pressure to disarm without withdrawal. In Lebanon, the violence continues in ways that normalized coverage often underplays, especially when medics and civilians are the ones paying the price. And underneath all of it is the same question. If a deal preserves the power of the strongest side while everyone else absorbs the damage, is that peace or just a pause before the next round? If you want more news that compares the headlines to the reality underneath them, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the part of today's coverage you think most people are missing. I read the comments, and they often shape the next breakdown. Tomorrow we'll keep following the Iran negotiations, the Gaza ceasefire battlefield map, and the political fallout back in the US. Because none of these stories are actually ending where the headlines say they are.